In this video, we're going to look at one slight variation to the inheritance ratios predicted by monohybrid crosses according to Gregor Mendel, and eventually what we're going to see is that if we look at the genotype rather than the phenotype, this falls exactly in line with what Gregor Mendel predicted, but in terms of the phenotype, there is one little variation that we need to address. So remember that Gregor Mendel's experiments were mostly done on pea plants. Now, one exception, as we're going to see, at least phenotypically, to the inheritance ratio of this specific plant occurs in this type of flower, which are what we call snapdragons. Now, snapdragons actually have three different phenotypes that are possible, but we're going to talk about where the third phenotype comes from. So the red flowers here are recognized as the dominant allele, and there's a very simple explanation as to why. In the event that the flower is red, this means that the plant possesses a gene that codes for a protein that tells the flower to make a chemical called a pigment, which is eventually going to turn this flower red. Now, on the other hand, if a flower is white, which is recognized as the recessive allele, white flowers don't produce a different pigment. They actually produce no pigment at all, meaning that white flowers are considered the recessive form because they don't have this gene at all that tells them to make any pigment, because they do not produce the protein that ultimately leads to the production of red pigment. So what this means is that if no gene is present at all, this is recognized as the recessive phenotype. Now, what Mendel did is he did the same thing as his initial pea plant experiment. He actually reproduced two purebred organisms. So we're going to do a simple Punnett square to see what the inheritance ratios are going to be if we know that the red colored flowers are homozygous dominant, meaning big R and little r, R for red, of course, while the white flowers are homozygous recessive, little r and little r. So if we do a fairly simple Punnett square, it should be pretty obvious to predict what all of the genotypes of the offspring are going to be. So the homozygous dominant parent can only produce gametes with the dominant allele, the big R allele, regardless of whether the paternal or maternal allele is contributed to gametes, and this is the same with the white flower. Only the recessive allele is possible to contribute. And when the paternal allele and maternal allele fertilize together and create a zygote, we can see that every one of these zygotes produced is going to be heterozygous, one dominant allele and one recessive allele. Now, we would expect that because red dominates over white, that all of the offspring would be red. However, this is not what was found at all. In other words, we have a third phenotype that is distinct from the homozygous dominant and the homozygous recessive phenotype. What was observed is that all heterozygous flowers ended up being pink rather than white or red, and there was a fairly simple explanation behind this. Because of the fact that the dominant allele codes for this protein that produces the pigment that ultimately turns the flower red, if a flower is heterozygous in terms of the genotype, it only has one red allele, which is only 50% of the number of alleles that are necessary in order to turn the flower a full red color, which means that only 50% of the protein that produces this pigment is produced, which is not enough in order to turn the flower completely red. So these flowers end up being pink because they literally only have about half of the pigment that is necessary in order to turn the flower into a full red color. Now, because the red allele is not completely dominant to the white allele because we end up with this kind of intermediary phenotype because of what the protein actually does. This phenomenon is what we call incomplete dominance, and this is the first sort of exception to the Mendelian inheritance ratios, although as we'll see, if we look at the genotypes line up exactly with what Gregor Mendel predicts, while the phenotype does not because of the consideration that was mentioned previously. So what we can do now is if we take two pink flowers, which we know are going to be heterozygous, and have them do a dihybrid cross, we can actually mathematically calculate what the inheritance ratios are. So each of our pink flowers, which are going to be the parents, can contribute the dominant allele or the recessive allele, but not both, because remember, each gamete can only contain 50% of the DNA of the parents, so they cannot contribute both the dominant allele and the recessive allele. And if we complete the Punnett square to find out what all of the genotypes of our gametes are, we have one homozygous dominant zygote here, this one here, and this one here would be heterozygous, and finally the one in the bottom right corner would have two copies of the recessive allele, and therefore this is our homozygous recessive organism here. Now, the reason why this deviates from the Mendelian inheritance ratio regarding phenotype is because we have this intermediary phenotype for heterozygous organisms. So what we need to do is we need to consider each individual genotype as a different phenotype here. We only have one homozygous dominant organism that would be produced here, so the chances are that we would have one out for every one, or for every four offspring that are produced, only one would be red according to the inheritance ratio. Likewise, only one we would expect to be white because only one of them is homozygous recessive, while 2 out of 4, or 1/2 if you prefer lowest terms, would be heterozygous and therefore would be pink. So genotypically, the inheritance ratios work exactly the way that Mendel predicted, but phenotypically, because of the third phenotype for heterozygous organisms, this is why this deviates from the 3-to-1 ratio that we see in a normal dihybrid cross. For the last consideration, let's say that this particular student claimed that red snapdragons can either be heterozygous or homozygous dominant. Now, if we ignore incomplete dominance, this would be true. And this student claimed that because red snapdragons have two different genotypes, we need a test cross in order to confirm what the genotype is. Now, the question is this student's assumption correct? Well, the answer to this is rather obviously no, because this assumption here is based on the fact that red snapdragons can have two different genotypes, but this is not true. We have established, because of incomplete dominance, that homozygous dominant are the flowers that are going to appear red, while heterozygous flowers have a completely different phenotype. They are going to be pink. So what this means is that no test cross is required at all, because every genotype, homozygous dominant, homozygous recessive, and heterozygous, have a distinct phenotype, meaning that it is actually rather easy to predict what the genotype is as long as we can see what the phenotype is as well. Before we move on to the next video, if you are not enthusiastic about plants, probably the next most famous example of incomplete dominance is actually in human hair curvature. So you can take a look at this practice problem set here that examines the relationship between curly hair, straight hair, and yet another intermediate phenotype, wavy hair. So if we assume that curly is the dominant phenotype, meaning that a person with fully curly hair is homozygous dominant, whereas a person with fully straight hair is homozygous recessive, we can assume that wavy hair as an intermediate phenotype is the heterozygous phenotype. Based on this, see if you can solve the situations below and calculate the inheritance probability depending on the curvature of hair of each of the parents in the situations below.